Hey, how are you, everybody? Good afternoon. Wanted to start the week with a thought of the day, a thought of the week, a Dvar Torah for all of us. So this week's Torah portion is Parshas Shoftim, Judges. And the beginning of the portion opens up with God's commandment that we should have a just society. God says Shoftim v'Shoftim, judges and policemen. You should put in all of your territory, and they should judge the people mishpat tzedek, justice of righteousness. And then one of the most famous quotes, the Torah says, tzedek, tzedek, tirdoif, righteousness, righteousness you shall pursue in order that you shall live and be blessed in the land that God has given us. So the rabbis who are always focused on every nuance and every detail ask a question. The rabbis say like this: why does it say righteous, righteous you shall pursue in order that you shall live? Why twice? Why the redundancy? Is there two kinds of righteousness? Is there two ways to be righteous? And the rabbis answer that in order to understand this, we have to understand something the Torah uses very often, as it does in the beginning of the portion. The Torah says you should judge the people mishpat tzedek, which means judgment of righteousness, justice of righteousness. What does that mean? Why mishpat and why tzedek? Why justice and righteousness? Could you have one without the other? Could you have righteousness without justice or justice without righteousness? And the rabbis say yes, there's a big difference between justice and righteousness, and you need the balance of both. And I can only tell you this in one of my favorite stories about Mayor LaGuardia, who was the mayor of New York City during the Great Depression, who has the famous LaGuardia airport named after him. And in fact, although his name is very Italian, happened to be Jewish. He was born in 1882 in Greenwich Village, a Catholic mom, to a Catholic dad, and to a Jewish mom from Italy. And although while he was mayor, he liked when people identified him as Italian and didn't always announce his Judaism, whenever it came to a Jewish issue, Jewish community, he stood up for them unequivocally. He fought Hitler. He was one of the biggest and loudest critics of Hitler during World War II. And the story has it, he's very famous for jumping onto the back of a fire truck or getting into a police car with a policeman, things like that made him very endeared to the people. And one day the story has it that it was 1935, in the middle of the Great Depression, in a freezing cold January night, when he walked into one of the poorest district's night courts, and he told the judge, he said, hey, you go home, I'll take over for you today. And one of the first cases that came to him was a grandmother who stole a loaf of bread. And the grandmother was put in front of him, and Mayor LaGuardia asked her, did you steal the loaf of bread? And she says, yes, but you need to understand, my daughter has two little kids. Her husband left her, walked out of her, and she's sick. And if I didn't steal the loaf of bread, my kids would die from starvation, my grandkids. Two little kids, how could I allow that? So the mayor turns to the owner of the bakery, and he says, do you still want to press charges after hearing her story? And he says, listen, I feel terrible for her, but I live in one of the worst neighborhoods. And if we don't press the charges and take a stand, everyone will be stealing and I won't be able to feed my own family. I need to press charges. Mayor LaGuardia was torn. What do I do? He could either do mishpat, which is justice. The law says if you steal a loaf of bread in those days, you pay $10 or 10 days in jail. So he's got to do justice as justice, or he can do righteousness. Look at this poor woman. She has grandchildren starving from death. Starvation if they don't get it. So Mayor LaGuardia said like this. He looked at the court, he looked at the woman, he said, listen, justice is justice. You stole a loaf of bread, you got to pay $10. And then to the shock of the entire court, he opened up his wallet, Mayor LaGuardia, and he opened up his wallet and he took out $10 and he gave it to the woman to pay her fine. It was an enormous amount. And then he looked at the court, to all the people, and in shocking words he said to them, I'm fining each and every one of you 50 cents for living in a city that allows a grandmother to have to steal a loaf of bread to feed her starving grandchildren. and he instructed the bailiff to go around the court, and he collected $47.50. The baker himself gave 50 cents as a fine, happily. And then he took this $47.50 and he gave it to the woman. And he said, "This is for you, so you could feed your grandchildren." You see, Mayor LaGuardia was torn. There was two types of righteousness. There was tzedek, righteousness, and justice. You steal, you gotta pay. But righteousness was, how could you have a justice system without compassion? If you can live in a city where someone could finish a 6-course meal and another grandmother should have to steal a loaf of bread to feed starving grandchildren, how could that be justice? Justice without compassion, justice that's deaf, that doesn't hear the cry of someone hungry, is not true justice. But if you only have righteousness and you don't have justice, then you'll have mayhem. You'll have a city gone crazy. Like maybe we see now in New York City, some will tell you. You need justice. It isn't personal. It doesn't discriminate amongst people. Everyone has the same justice and has to follow the same rules. But at the same point, you also need righteousness that could hear the cry and have the compassion. Now you might ask me, is this a true story with Mayor LaGuardia? The last time I checked it on Snopes had no way to disprove it, but Snopes also had no facts to verify it. But do I need Snopes? Do I need Mayor LaGuardia? 1700 years ago in the Talmud tells us a story about the greatest Jewish king who lived 2,900 years ago, who was King David. And the Gemara tells us that it says that King David, in Kings, in the prophets, it says, David al Kol Yisrael. David was a king over all the Jewish people. He David, and King David did tzedek, mishpat, tzedakah, justice and righteousness to all his people. So the Gemara asked the question, I don't understand, if it was justice, it wasn't righteousness. And if it was righteousness, it wasn't justice. So the Gemara says that when someone came to King David's court and a poor person was guilty of owing money to a rich person, King David would say, you have to pay the money. And then he would take his own money and give it to the poor person to pay the rich person, or the person who he owed it to, or she owed it to. And that's what it says, that King David, not January night, in the middle of depression, but every day of King David's kingdom and ruling, he remembered to have in one hand tzedek and in the other hand mishpat. He had righteousness and he had justice. And that's why the Torah tells us, say, tzedek tirdof. The Torah says righteousness. The Torah says you have to judge the people with mishpat tzedek, with justice and righteousness. We live in a society that's so torn. From one side, we have people on one extreme who say justice is justice. If you can't make it, if you can't afford to pay your bills, if you can't afford health insurance, if you can't afford food on your table for your children and your grandchildren, that's life. Fear is fear. Why should I part with my hard-earned money that I made? Just because I have a big house doesn't mean I have to look after you. They say justice is justice. And then there's the other extreme. People say righteousness. We have to give it all away. Just because you made it doesn't mean it's yours. Why not share it with someone else? And the Torah, throughout every part of the Bible that we read, and throughout the Talmud, tries to give us that balance. It says tzedek tirdof. You need to be able to have a pursuit, a balance of righteousness and righteousness. You need justice. No, you can't have a system that decides everything on the heart. You need to have justice, where rules are rules. And if rules are broken, there has to be consequences. But you also need compassion. You also need righteousness. You also have to care for the poor, for those that are vulnerable, for those that are caring. You know, there's an old folk story about this father sick. And he lived with his son, who worked to provide for him. And they only had one coat. They lived in an old, broken down home, and there was no heat. And the son said, I need the one coat because I go out to work every day to provide for my father who stays at home. And the father said, I need the coat. I'm old and frail. My bones are shivering. You're young, you're strong. And they each fought who should have the coat. The rabbi. So the rabbi said, Let me think about it. He heard the two arguments. One said, listen, I'm old and frail, I need the coat. One said, I'm supporting my father, I'm going out to work in the cold, I need the coat. The judge said, the rabbi said, come back to me in a few days. Meanwhile, they went home, and on the way home, the son was thinking to himself, he says, what am I doing? I'm young. My father's right. I'm strong. I could get out there. Yeah, it's cold, but I have strong bones. I'm a young man. I should give it to my father. And the father said, what am I, crazy? My son, who cares so much about me to work to provide food for me, and I don't want to give him the coat. My son needs the coat. It's not for me. And they fought, and each one said, I don't want the coat. You should have it. So he said, we're going back to the rabbi. They came back to the rabbi. The rabbi listened to the story, and he listened to each one fighting. The next one should have the coat. He said, I have a solution. I have an extra coat. I'm going to give it to you, and each one of you can have a coat. They were amazed. What a solution. But then the son said to the rabbi, I'm bursting with curiosity. It doesn't make sense. If you were going to give us a coat, why didn't you give it us when we came the first time? Why only now? And the rabbi said like this. When you came the first time, each one of you said, I want the coat. I need the coat. So I didn't have extra coat. When you came with justice, with what's right, then there was no extra coat. I needed my coat too. It was justice that was speaking. But the second time you came with righteousness. Each one said the other one needs the coat. And at that moment, I saw it from tzedek, from righteousness. And I said, 1 second, I should give you my coat. You're going out to work. You're cold and shivering. I'll give you my coat. When it came to righteousness, I saw from a different perspective. Look, not every one of us is a LaGuardia, Mayor LaGuardia, and we're definitely not no King Davids. But each and every one of us goes around all day judging people. We judge our co-workers, we judge our spouses, we judge our parents, we judge our children, we judge our housekeepers, we judge our bosses, we judge our governors, we judge our mayors, we judge our teachers, we judge our superintendents in school. We go around all day judging people. But we need to have righteousness too. If you have justice without righteousness, if you're only judging people all day, then the harshness of judging people removes you from people and removes the passion we need for a society. So I plead with you. We're living through unprecedented times. We're living through a pandemic. We're living through a challenge that can last us throughout the whole year. The high holidays are coming. Thursday's Rosh Chodesh and Friday of the month of Elul, when we come to search God and to seek God and to ask Him to bless us with a new year, to remove from us all harshness and bless us with a new year. I beg you to listen to this week's Torah portion. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdon. You need both kinds of righteousness. What does it say? Shoftim v'shodrim. We need judges and we need police and we need both of them. And they should judge the people mishpat tzedek. And I'll leave you with this. Remember, you need justice and you need righteousness. Justice without righteousness is blind and has no vision and doesn't understand and hear the pain and the cry of the ones that need it. But righteousness without justice is anarchy. It's mayhem. It's a society that will never survive. And I think that that's what our country's suffering with most. We're going on to election now. And all you hear is tzedek and mishpat. Without the tzedek and mishpat together, I plead with you and with us to combine the two and to remember the most important Torah, the most important verse that Torah teaches us for eternity when it comes to justice. You need justice and righteousness. Righteous you'll pursue. And then he says, you should, because if you have both righteousness and justice, you will live a long life on the land that God has given you with full of blessings for all of us. Have a great day.